Think for a moment about what it means to discover a text hidden for centuries, a forbidden manuscript that challenges the official story and invites us to rethink what we thought we knew. Imagine that everything tradition has repeated for generations about one of the most controversial figures in Christianity may not be entirely true. And now imagine that an ancient text, buried in the Egyptian sands for more than 1700 years, suddenly comes to light to reveal a completely different story. This is the case of the so-called Gospel of Judas. In this video, we are going to dive deep into the secrets of this lost gospel, a Gnostic document that has sparked controversy, fascination, and even fear since its discovery. And what is even more striking, what it reveals about Judas Iscariot could change not only the way we understand the figure of this man, but also the message of Jesus himself. I promise you that what we will uncover toward the end of this journey will be the most powerful of all, a revelation that could transform how you perceive betrayal, redemption, and the true divine plan. Before we go any further, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and spread it with your friends. What you are about to discover here are surprising revelations, hidden pieces of humanity's spiritual history that may very well change the way you see life and the universe. Now let us return to Egypt. In the 1970s, in the Egyptian desert, a papyrus codex written in Coptic, the language that evolved from ancient Egyptian, was unearthed. This codex, later dated to between the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, contained something unheard of, a text titled the Gospel of Judas. For decades, it remained in the hands of antiquities dealers and private collectors until it was finally restored, translated, and revealed to the world in the early 21st century. When news of its publication broke in 2006, the world was stunned. How could there be a gospel attributed to Judas, the disciple forever branded as the ultimate betrayer? For centuries, Judas has been portrayed as the villain of the New Testament, the man who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, the one responsible for delivering Jesus into the hands of those who crucified him. But this ancient manuscript suggested something very different. It presented Judas not as a traitor, but as the one disciple who truly understood Jesus. This revelation immediately stirred controversy. Some scholars dismissed it as heretical fiction, while others claimed it was an authentic reflection of early Christian diversity. The Catholic Church quickly condemned it, warning that such writings could mislead the faithful. And yet, curiosity spread like fire. People wanted to know, what did Judas really do and what role did he play in the spiritual mission of Christ? The Gospel of Judas portrays conversations between Jesus and Judas in which the Master reveals secret knowledge. Unlike the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this text is not concerned with miracles, parables, or a linear biography of Jesus. Instead, it focuses on mystical teachings, cosmic visions, and the destiny of the soul. It belongs to the tradition of Gnosticism, a spiritual movement that emphasized hidden wisdom, inner awakening, and the idea that salvation comes through knowledge rather than through blind obedience. In the text, Jesus laughs at the other disciples because they fail to understand his true nature. He tells Judas that he, alone among the 12, is capable of receiving the deepest truths. And then comes the shocking statement. Judas will help Jesus fulfill his divine mission, not by loyalty in the conventional sense, but through an act that appears as betrayal to the world. By handing Jesus over to the authorities, Judas is actually enabling the liberation of the divine spirit within him. Can you see how radically different this is from what most of us were taught? Instead of being damned as the darkest figure in Christian history, Judas is portrayed as the one chosen to carry out the most difficult task, the disciple who understood Jesus better than anyone else. Think for a moment, what if betrayal was not betrayal at all, but rather obedience to a higher plan? What if the role of Judas was not treachery, but sacrifice? This flips the story upside down. It forces us to question the narratives that shaped Western spirituality for 2,000 years, and it invites us to consider the possibility that history has been written and rewritten by those in power, while other voices, sometimes the most profound ones, were silenced or destroyed. The Gospel of Judas, buried for centuries, may be one of those voices. Now, this does not mean we should accept every word uncritically. Scholars such as Elaine Pagels, expert in early Christianity and Gnosticism, remind us that these texts are windows into the diversity of beliefs that existed among the first followers of Jesus. They show us that Christianity was never monolithic, but rather a tapestry of different visions, some of which were later labeled as heresy. The Gospel of Judas belongs to that stream, offering a perspective that was suppressed by the mainstream church. Pause for a moment and reflect. If Judas was not the ultimate traitor, but instead a trusted disciple fulfilling a sacred role, how would that change the way we see forgiveness, loyalty, and even the nature of good and evil? Could it be that what looks like darkness on the surface hides a deeper light? Could it be that the plan of Jesus was so vast, so mysterious, that only one who truly loved him could endure the burden of being hated forever by history? These questions are not just historical. They touch the very heart of spirituality. They remind us that truth is often hidden beneath layers of dogma and fear. They invite us to dig deeper, to ask boldly, and to be willing to challenge what we thought was unquestionable. And this is only the beginning. Stay with me, because as we go deeper into the Gospel of Judas, you will see passages that challenge not only the story of Judas himself, but also the meaning of sacrifice, salvation, and the true identity of Jesus. And I assure you, the most powerful revelation is yet to come. To understand the Gospel of Judas, we need to step into the world of the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ. Christianity at that time was not a single, unified religion. It was a movement filled with debates, rival teachings, and multiple interpretations of Jesus' message. In Alexandria, in Syria, in Rome, and across the Mediterranean, groups of believers gathered in secret, sharing different gospels, each with its own vision of truth. Some of these writings became what we now call the New Testament. Others were suppressed, destroyed, or hidden away. The Gospel of Judas belongs to that second category. It reflects the worldview of the Gnostics, a community of seekers who believed that divine truth was not for the masses, but for those with the courage and insight to seek hidden wisdom. The Gnostics taught that the material world was not the ultimate creation of the highest God, but a kind of prison shaped by lesser spiritual powers. According to their vision, human beings carry a spark of divine light within them, but this light is trapped in the world of flesh and ignorance. The mission of Christ in this framework was to awaken the hidden spark, to teach souls how to return to their true origin. Seen through this lens, the Gospel of Judas makes sense. Jesus is not here simply to perform miracles or to establish an earthly kingdom. He is here to reveal the mysteries of existence, and Judas, rather than being condemned, is entrusted with the task of helping to set Jesus free from his human body so that the divine Christ can return to the higher realms. What mainstream Christianity calls betrayal may have been understood by the Gnostics as cooperation in a sacred plan. Think about the implications of this. For centuries, Judas has been a symbol of treachery, the very embodiment of deceit and sin. But in this text, he becomes a paradoxical hero. He is the disciple who has the courage to do what none of the others could. He carries out the hardest role, to hand over his beloved master, knowing that the world would forever curse his name. Imagine what kind of inner strength or perhaps love that would require. The text itself describes moments when Jesus takes Judas aside, away from the other disciples, to share teachings no one else was ready to receive. This echoes a pattern found in other Gnostic writings, where secret knowledge, gnosis, is reserved for the few who are prepared. Elaine Pagels, the renowned scholar of early Christianity, explains that these secret gospels were not about contradicting Jesus, but about offering deeper layers of meaning to those willing to look beyond surface faith. And yet, this perspective was deeply threatening to the early church leaders who sought to establish unity and authority. If salvation could come through inner knowledge rather than obedience to the church, then institutional power was at risk. That is one of the reasons why texts like the Gospel of Judas were rejected, labeled heresy, and destroyed whenever possible. But as history shows, truth has a way of surviving in hidden corners, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. Consider how this story of suppression mirrors the spiritual journey itself. Often the most powerful truths are buried, hidden beneath layers of tradition, fear, or misunderstanding. Just as the manuscript lay in the sands of Egypt for centuries, so too do the deepest insights lie dormant within us, waiting for the seeker who dares to uncover them. Could it be that the rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas is not just an accident of archaeology, but a sign for our age, a reminder to question, to seek, to awaken? Now let us reflect more deeply on the character of Judas. In the canonical Gospels, he is depicted as greedy, weak, and possessed by Satan himself. But the Gospel of Judas paints another portrait, one of intimacy and destiny. In one passage, Jesus tells Judas that he will be cursed by generations, but that his role is essential for the divine plan to be fulfilled. Think about that for a moment. What does it mean to embrace a mission that will forever condemn you in the eyes of the world? Could Judas's act be seen not as betrayal, but as ultimate sacrifice? This question takes us beyond history and into the realm of spiritual reflection. How many times in our own lives do we judge situations by appearances, calling them evil, when in reality they may carry a hidden purpose? How often do we label others as villains without understanding the larger story unfolding behind the scenes? The figure of Judas, reimagined by this gospel, becomes a mirror for us to question the nature of judgment, loyalty, and divine mystery. And this is where the power of this ancient text lies. It is not just about revising history, it is about awakening consciousness. It invites us to move beyond black and white categories of good and evil, to recognize that the divine plan may operate on levels we cannot easily perceive. It challenges us to see with spiritual eyes, not just human ones. But of course, such a radical vision was dangerous in its time. By the year 367, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote a letter denouncing all writings outside the official scriptures as heresy. From that moment, works like the Gospel of Judas were systematically hunted down. The fact that one copy survived, hidden in Egypt, is almost miraculous. It is as if history itself conspired to keep this secret alive until a moment when humanity would be ready to confront it. We are only scratching the surface of its mysteries. As we continue, we will explore some of the actual passages of the Gospel of Judas, words that may shock you, words that flip the traditional story upside down. And remember, the greatest revelation of all is still waiting. Stay with me, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the role of Judas, the mission of Jesus, and the true meaning of salvation. Now let us turn directly to the words of the Gospel of Judas, fragments of which have survived through the ages. These passages give us a glimpse into a conversation that seems to break every boundary of conventional Christianity. One of the most striking moments comes when Jesus tells Judas, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." What could this mean? To the Gnostics, the human body was like a garment, a temporary vessel for the divine spirit. In this light, Jesus is telling Judas that his role is to free him from the prison of the flesh. Far from being an act of betrayal, Judas's action becomes the key to liberation. It is Judas who allows the divine Christ to return to the eternal realms beyond matter. This interpretation radically transforms the crucifixion itself. Rather than being the tragic end of a failed mission, it becomes the fulfillment of a cosmic plan. Jesus is not a victim of betrayal, but a master guiding his disciple to play the role that will release him from the bonds of the earthly world. Judas is not the destroyer of the mission, but the one who makes it possible. Of course, this reading is unsettling. It challenges everything we have been taught about good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, sin and redemption. But is that not the very essence of wisdom? To disrupt, to provoke, to awaken us from the comfort of certainty? The Gospel of Judas dares us to ask, what if the story we have believed for centuries is only one version, shaped by those who won the struggle for authority, while other voices were silenced? In another section, the text shows Jesus laughing at the prayers of the other disciples, saying they do not understand the true God. To the Gnostics, this was a reminder that much of what passes as religion is mere imitation, devotion to powers that are not the highest source. Judas, however, is portrayed as the one who perceives beyond appearances. He recognizes the true nature of Jesus, not just as a teacher or prophet, but as the revealer of hidden worlds. Think of the courage this demands. Judas must act against the expectations of his fellow disciples. He must endure eternal condemnation. He must step into the role of villain so that the greater plan may unfold. It is a story of paradox. The man condemned as traitor may, in truth, be the one disciple who obeyed most completely. Consider for a moment what this means for us. How often do we find ourselves trapped in appearances, quick to judge by surface events? How often do we fail to see that what looks like loss may hide a deeper victory, that what appears as betrayal may, in the mystery of life, carry the seeds of transformation? The Gospel of Judas pushes us to expand our vision, to move beyond the limits of ordinary perception, and to embrace the idea that divine wisdom is larger than human categories. Scholars like Bart Ehrman, a leading historian of early Christianity, remind us that texts like the Gospel of Judas do not simply replace the canonical Gospels, but rather reveal the diversity of belief that flourished in the first centuries. These writings show us that the earliest Christians wrestled with the same questions we wrestle with today. Who was Jesus? What was his mission? What does it mean to be saved? And perhaps most importantly, what role do human beings play in the divine plan? The answers varied, and the Gospel of Judas offers one of the most radical. It suggests that salvation is not about blind faith or submission, but about awakening to knowledge. It presents Jesus not only as a savior, but as a revealer of cosmic truth, and it portrays Judas not as the villain of the story, but as the intimate disciple entrusted with the hardest task. Pause and let that sink in. If this gospel is right, then the greatest villain in Christian tradition may also be its most misunderstood figure. The very name Judas, which has become synonymous with treachery, might conceal the story of ultimate obedience. Imagine the weight of carrying such a destiny, chosen to help fulfill the mission, yet forever despised by history. Is that not a kind of martyrdom in itself? As we reflect on these themes, the Gospel of Judas becomes more than an ancient manuscript. It becomes a mirror for our own spiritual journey. It challenges us to consider the possibility that truth is hidden, that appearances deceive, and that sometimes the role we least expect is the one most necessary for the unfolding of a greater design. And yet, we must not forget, this text was hidden for a reason. For the Church Fathers of the 4th century, such teachings were intolerable. They threatened to dissolve the structures of authority that held the community together. A gospel that exalts Judas, that places secret knowledge above obedience, was a dangerous text. To preserve their unity, the leaders of the Church erased it from view. For nearly 1700 years, it was lost, until now. Its rediscovery is more than an archaeological event. It is a spiritual signpost. It tells us that the suppressed voices of history still matter, that the truth silenced in one age may return in another. And perhaps it is no coincidence that the Gospel of Judas emerges in our time, a time of questioning, of spiritual seeking, of longing to break free from rigid dogmas and rediscover the mysteries of existence. Stay with me, because in the next part, we will explore the deepest and most controversial idea of all, what the Gospel of Judas suggests about the very nature of God, the universe, and the path of the soul. This is where the most powerful revelation awaits, the one that may forever change how you see the story of Jesus, Judas, and the destiny of humanity. We now arrive at the most challenging and powerful part of this journey, the ultimate vision that the Gospel of Judas presents about the nature of God, the universe, and humanity's destiny. To truly grasp its meaning, we must let go of the conventional frameworks we have inherited and allow ourselves to see with fresh eyes. In the canonical tradition, God is the all-powerful creator, Jesus is the obedient Son, and salvation comes through faith and obedience. But in the Gnostic vision preserved in the Gospel of Judas, the picture is more complex. The text describes a universe governed not only by the highest God, the ineffable source of light, but also by lower rulers, spiritual powers, who shaped the material world. To the Gnostics, this world was not the perfect creation of the ultimate God, but a flawed reflection, a place of exile where the soul is trapped. This is why Jesus, in the Gospel of Judas, mocks the prayers of the other disciples. They worship powers they do not understand, thinking they are serving the true God while actually remaining bound to the rulers of the material world. Judas alone perceives the higher reality. He alone understands that Jesus' mission is not to glorify the world of flesh, but to liberate the spirit from it. Here lies the heart of the revelation. Judas's act handing Jesus over is not a betrayal, but a sacred duty. By doing so, he helps Jesus shed the garment of the body, allowing the divine Christ to return to the eternal realms. Judas becomes, paradoxically, the one disciple who obeys completely, the one who has the courage to enact the plan that no one else could bear. He is cursed in history but blessed in mystery. Now pause and reflect. What if this is true? What if Judas, the name that for centuries has symbolized treachery, is in fact the name of the one who understood Jesus best? What if betrayal is not what it seemed, but an act of hidden fidelity to the divine will? This does not erase the pain of the crucifixion, but it reframes it as part of a cosmic drama in which even apparent darkness serves the light. The implications are immense. If Judas is not the villain but the chosen one, then our very notions of good and evil, loyalty and treachery are overturned, and perhaps that is the point. The Gospel of Judas invites us to look beyond appearances, to see that the divine plan operates at levels we cannot easily comprehend. It asks us to consider that what we fear, what we condemn, may in fact conceal a deeper wisdom. This is why the rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas is so important in our time. We live in an age when people are searching beyond dogma, yearning to recover the mystical dimensions of faith. The questions raised by this ancient text echo within us. Are we willing to look beyond tradition? Are we prepared to see with spiritual eyes rather than the eyes of habit? Are we open to the possibility that the truth is far greater than the stories we were told? And let us not forget the emotional dimension of this. Think about Judas himself, not as a symbol, but as a man. Imagine the burden of knowing that your role is to hand over your beloved teacher, that your name will be cursed by generations, that your memory will be stained forever. Yet you carry out this mission anyway, not for glory, not for recognition, but because you understand the necessity of the act. Is this not a kind of martyrdom as profound as any other? Perhaps Judas is the disciple who sacrificed not his body, but his reputation, his very soul in the eyes of humanity, to fulfill the will of his master. Elaine Pagels and other scholars remind us that whether or not the Gospel of Judas records literal events, its symbolic meaning is undeniable. It reveals that early Christians were wrestling with profound spiritual questions, and that some saw Judas not as a villain but as a hero of hidden wisdom. The text forces us to acknowledge the diversity of early Christianity, and it reminds us that the history we know is not the only history that existed. And so we come to the final and most powerful revelation that Judas may not be the story of a man alone, but a symbol of the spiritual path itself. Each of us must face the paradox of life, the tension between light and darkness, faith and doubt, obedience and freedom. Each of us must confront the moments when we feel misunderstood, condemned, or rejected, even when we are following a higher calling. The figure of Judas becomes a mirror, reflecting back the mystery of our own struggles, the hidden meaning of our own sacrifices. So, what does the Gospel of Judas really say? It tells us that history is not as simple as we thought. It tells us that the deepest truths are often hidden, suppressed, or buried until the right time. It tells us that even those condemned as villains may, in the eyes of eternity, be servants of the light. And above all, it reminds us that the story of Jesus is not only about suffering and death, but about awakening, liberation, and the triumph of the Spirit over the prison of the flesh. This is the mystery the Gospel of Judas offers us. Not a simple story, but a challenge to see more deeply, to question more boldly, and to awaken to the possibility that what we thought was betrayal may in fact be the highest form of love. So I ask you now, what do you think? Could it be that Judas Iscariot, forever branded as the traitor, was in fact the disciple who understood Jesus best? Could it be that what we call darkness is only light in disguise? Share your reflections in the comments, because your perspective matters in this journey of discovery. And if this exploration has opened your mind, remember to subscribe, like, and share, so that together we can continue uncovering the hidden wisdom that has shaped humanity's spiritual path. The sands of Egypt preserved this secret for 17 centuries. Today you have heard its voice. The Gospel of Judas has spoken. The question now is, are we ready to listen? Thanks for looking.